But in the Middle East, always, the ideal is one thing, the real is another thing. What you say is much more important than what you do. Aye, Father, I'm going into the vineyard to work. I have no intention to do it, but this was respectful, wasn't it? So, yes, aye, Father. What you say, much more important than what you do. Your armies will roll in the blood in the ditches, he said. And then he went and had tea. What he said was not at all what he meant. And that's what parables are. You say one thing, you mean another thing. That's typical Middle East.
لعنت خدا بر رژیم غاصب صهیونی است. دستگاه‌های سفارت در هر کشوری که وجود دارد به منزله خاک همون کشوری است که سفارت متعلق به اوست. وقتی به کنسولگری ما حمله میکنن مثل اینکه به خاک ما حمله کردن. این عرف دنیاست.
A calibrated response. What do you think the Iranians hoped to achieve last night?
They certainly hoped to achieve some hits, and they got some. They seem to have got 7 hits on the Nevatim air base, which is symbolically important to them because the Nevatim base is the base, it's the F-35 base, it's a big air base in the Negev desert, which is where
F-35 fighters.
Exactly. The F-35s took off from there to bomb the consulate in Syria, in Damascus, on the 1st of April. So as far as the Iranians are concerned, they've hit the base from which the strike against their consulate was launched. So symbolically, that's important. It is reported that they've done some damage to outbuildings, but there is no casualties. It has been reported around the Arab world that the base has completely been wiped off the map, which is clearly not true. So they got 7 missiles, ballistic missiles through. They launched, it seems, this is from IDF figures, the Israeli defense figures, they launched 110 ballistic missiles, and 7 of them got through. They launched 36 cruise missiles, none of them got through. They launched 185 drones, none of them got through. So statistically, less than 1% of their missiles got through, but the 7 ballistic missiles that may, if all 7 hit the airbase, that gives them a symbolic victory.
But in the Middle East, always, the ideal is one thing, the real is another thing. What you say is much more important than what you do. Aye, Father, I'm going into the vineyard to work. I have no intention to do it, but this was respectful, wasn't it? So, yes, aye, Father. What you say, much more important than what you do. Your armies will roll in the blood in the ditches, he said. And then he went and had tea. What he said was not at all what he meant. And that's what parables are. You say one thing, you mean another thing. That's typical Middle East.
So, you know, any reasonable person might say, well, that's tit for tat in terms of Damascus on the 1st of April and now the base from which the attack was launched now. Maybe that should be an end to it. Any reasonable person might say that. But we're dealing here with Netanyahu as Prime Minister and Ali Khamenei as the Supreme Leader.
And we are not talking about reasonable...
Neither of them are particularly reasonable.
The situation doesn't make anybody reasonable.
No, exactly. I mean, and this is, you know, this round of conflict, this particular iteration, started with the Israelis going after IRGC generals and, you know, in an embassy. Now, going after IRGC generals is acceptable in the sense that they are attacking Israel, and so Israel goes after them wherever they can find them. But going after them in a consular building in Damascus is specifically against international law. It's very provocative. The Israelis seem to do it out of the blue, almost as if they wanted to provoke Iran to see how much Iran would do in response. And the Iranians are now saying that this is the end of it. They have said, this is our response. Now, whether they'll stick to that, we don't know. But they've probably got enough out of this. 7 out of 331 missiles got through. That's a pretty low percentage. But if the symbolism of hitting the airbase is good enough, then maybe they'll say, that's it, we don't want any more.
So the outcome here was never really meant to be, as it were, a military advantage, but more one of storytelling, if I can put it that way, particularly presumably to their own people. Because it's not going to convince anybody else, particularly.
Absolutely. And that storytelling began a few hours ago with editorials being written in newspapers and across the Arab media that the air base has been wiped off the face of the earth, which it clearly hasn't.
But in the Middle East, always, the ideal is one thing, the real is another thing. What you say is much more important than what you do. Aye, aye, Father, I'm going into the vineyard to work. I have no intention to do it, but this was respectful, wasn't it? So yes, aye, aye, Father. What you say, much more important than what you do. Your armies will roll in the blood in the ditches, he said. And then he went and had tea. What he said was not at all what he meant. And that's what parables are. You say one thing, you mean another thing. That's typical Middle East.
So, people's different narratives might actually be a way out of this iteration of the crisis. But everyone assumes that Israel, having been struck, now this is inside Israeli territory, albeit the Negev desert down in the south, but given that Iranian missiles have now struck inside Israel, will the Israelis say, well, we're not going to respond? The general view is that everyone will tell them not to respond. The Americans will certainly lean on them not to respond. Look, this is enough. This has gone far enough, and this now completes this cycle of violence from the 1st of April to now. But that Netanyahu won't be restrained because he's getting something out of this widening of the war. It keeps him in power.
Well, there's been an occupation for 75 years. And so Israel says, we get to occupy you maybe for the rest of time. And anyone who helps you, anyone who fights back is a dirty terrorist. And it's always their fault. So we can occupy you forever. And right now, that is literally the Israeli government's position. Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government in Israel are saying, we are never going to give the Palestinians a state. Never. But they should never fight back. And if they do, it's definitely their fault. And if anyone helps them, it's definitely their fault. They should just know that there are prisoners forever and ever and ever. And so, look, whether you are so deluded that you believe that, it doesn't really matter, because do you think Israel's going to be safe if you occupy another people for the rest of eternity? You think that they're just going to all submit, like, oh, yes, Israel is our Lord and Savior now, and we will never, ever, ever fight back? They're not going to do that. That's not how the real world works. Of course they're going to fight back. Okay, so you can get into that debate for 1,000 years, but the bottom line on what has happened recently and why Iran has launched these today is because Israel did a strike inside Syria at the Iranian embassy, and that is basically the equivalent of striking within Iran. They killed 7 top commanders, including one of the top generals in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is their main, military group that protects the ruling class in Iran, etc. So standard caveats. I got no love for the Iranian government. They're fundamentalist, and I'm secular. They would have no interest in me. I got no interest in them. I wish that Iran could be a democracy again. It's not. So those are obvious things, but that's not the point. The point is, why are we in the middle of this mess? And it's definitely because Israel hit the consulate and killed our top general. And that was Netanyahu's right-wing government saying, I want a war. I'm picking a war with Iran. Look, guys, none of this is unclear. And anyone who tells you otherwise is definitively lying. And you could look it up with New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. You can see all the reporting from the past. So Netanyahu is agitated with a war with Iran and has asked America to engage in a war with Iran for now over a decade. He was furious with Obama for signing a peace deal with Iran, where we actually prevented them from getting nukes. He asked Trump to get us out of that deal, and Trump did, which made war much more likely. And Iran went back to enriching uranium because they said, well, if you don't want a peace deal, then we won't give you a peace deal. I'm not going to give you the thing that you want, where I take all the uranium out and take all of our capabilities out, and in return I get nothing. No. So Iran went back to doing that. So then Netanyahu says, see, they might be developing nukes. So you now definitely have to invade them. So Israel definitely picked this war. Definitely. Netanyahu, and again, it's not all the people of Israel, guys. It's the same as when America went to war with Iraq. America was definitely at fault, but the American people didn't all sign up for that. We had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting that, millions of people overall. Israel has thousands of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people protesting Netanyahu. So they're not a monolith, but the government, the right-wing government of Israel, has been agitating for this war and purposely hit the Iranian consulate to try to provoke this reaction. And it leaves Iran as a country, again, no matter how much I might hate their government, it leaves them no choice. There is no country in the world that is going to get their embassy or consulate hit and go, oh, okay, you just kill us anytime you like, we won't respond. That's not a thing that happens in this world. And if you were saying, no, Israel should get to kill anyone they want in the Iranian government or the Iranian military, and Iran has no right to respond, it doesn't matter that you think that. That's a lunatic position. And by the way, the position held by the US government, the British government, the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party.
Remember how often 40 days appears in the Bible? You know, Moses is on Mount Sinai 40 days, rains 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah's 40 days in the valley of the brook Cherith, fed by a raven. Jesus is 40 days tempted by the devil in the desert. What's this 40 thing? I happened to be in the Middle East when the Gulf War broke out. And I should have brought a slide of it. I have the speech that Saddam Hussein gave in Baghdad the day that bombing commenced. The opening line of the speech is, "My fellow Iraqis, today we have won the war." Now, from a military point of view, he was getting the crap kicked out of him. And everybody, including Saddam Hussein, knew he was going to lose. When a bully picks on you in the honor-shame world, it's not expected that you will be able to withstand the onslaught of a bully. What's expected is that you will resist long enough to show your courage. Then when you surrender, there is no shame. You get your newspaper out sometime and figure out how long it was from the time we began bombing till the day Saddam Hussein surrendered. It's 40 days. Before that began, before that Iraq war broke out, think what George Bush and Saddam Hussein were doing. They were in a pissing match. They were calling us the great Satan, and we were calling Saddam Hussein terrible things, and going back and forth and back and forth. What did Saddam Hussein do 1 week before the bombing broke out? He sent Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, to Russia and asked them to negotiate. That's what you do in the Middle East if you want to try to prevent this from breaking out in violence. What did George Bush do in response? Absolutely refused. Olivia's comment to me was, "You are barbarians. What's the matter with you?" And the day we started bombing, their assumption was we lost. Saddam Hussein's honor ranking just went right to the ceiling. There was a paper written by a member of our State Department just before that war broke out on honor and shame, a lifelong diplomat in the Middle East, trying to explain to George Bush why if we stayed out of this, the Arab world would take care of him. He had done something evil to an Arab brother. But you get involved, this paper said, and you're going to save his life. George Bush refused to read that paper. And the war broke out, and here Saddam Hussein is still in power. I guess my point is the core value, folks, is not only in the biblical text, it still exists today.